Good evening, everyone. I'm Billy Gastic-Rosado, Provost at LaGuardia Community College, and I'm delighted to welcome you to LaGuardia for this panel on LGBTQ+ political representation in Queens. We are joined tonight by a distinguished group of elected officials from the New York City Council to discuss political and cultural changes in our borough in recent years. As openly gay and lesbian public servants, they have been trailblazers in our neighborhoods. They have helped transform New York politics by expanding civil rights, supporting healthcare reform, advocating for criminal justice overhaul, challenging traditional cultural norms, and funding social and educational organizations and institutions. Though they all had impressive careers working for change at the grassroots level prior to their elections to the City Council, they all understood that political representation was necessary to foster change. I'd like to introduce them, starting with the current council members. First, Council Member Lynn Shulman grew up in Forest Hills and is a longtime community and LGBTQ activist. With decades of leadership in healthcare advocacy and progressive causes, she was elected to the City Council because of her vision on how to bring the changes needed in Queens communities. Her early work in healthcare was born out of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, where she worked for the gay men's health crisis after seeing friends and neighbors die needlessly due to the lack of available care. In her role as healthcare chair on the council, she has also implemented legislation and has been a vocal leader for care regarding the monkeypox virus and other LGBTQ+ related health issues. Tiffany Caban, a Queens native, was born in Richmond Hill to Puerto Rican parents. Her father was an elevator mechanic. Her mother was a children's caretaker. Both had been raised in New York City Housing Authority's Woodside houses. Tiffany spent years as a public defender fighting the brutal system of mass incarceration before running for office. In 2019, she lost a long-shot race for Queens DA by just 55 votes. And 2 years later became the City Council member representing District 22, which includes Astoria, Rikers Island, and parts of Jackson Heights, Woodside, and East Elmhurst. Currently, she serves as co-chair of the City Council's LGBTQIA+ caucus. Jimmy Van Bramer, a lifelong resident of Western Queens, was elected to the New York City Council in 2009. He was overwhelmingly elected to a second four-year term in 2013 and a third term in 2017. During the 2014-17 session, Councilmember Van Bramer was the majority leader of the New York City Council. He served as chair of the Cultural Affairs and Library Committee for 12 years and spent 9 years on the budget negotiating team, which plays an integral role in formulating the city's budget process to fund critical programs, projects, and organizations citywide. Currently, he serves as the Chief Growth and Strategic Partnerships Officer at the Girl Scouts of Greater New York. Daniel Drum is an educator, activist, and former New York City Council member. Drum taught at PS 199 for 25 years before coming out publicly as a gay teacher in 1992 to support the LGBTQ inclusive Children of the Rainbow curriculum. In 2002, he became the first openly gay elected official from Queens when he was elected as Democratic District Leader. Drum was elected to the City Council in 2009. During his tenure, he worked on 4 major issues: immigration, education, criminal justice reform, and LGBTQ+ rights. He says his proudest legislative achievements include the creation of ID New York City, NYC's identification card, removing ICE from Rikers Island, and fighting to end solitary confinement. He also established the LGBTQ liaison position in the Department of Education. As finance chair, the council's second most powerful position, he had oversight of the city's $100 billion budget. Now retired, Drum serves on the board of several Irish organizations, LGBT groups, and is on the executive board of the UFT Retired Teachers Chapter. This is an impressive group. Finally, our moderator tonight is Stephen Petrus, the Director of Public History Programs at LaGuardia and Wagner Archives here on campus. Stephen received his PhD in history at the CUNY Graduate Center. And prior to his work at LaGuardia, he taught courses in urban and cultural history for 6 years at Lehman College. Among his publications, he is co-author of the critically acclaimed book, Folk City, New York and the American Folk Music Revival. And his research has been supported by the Mellon and Pew Foundations. At LaGuardia, he has co-curated 5 exhibits on LGBTQ+ topics, including A Seat at the Table, LGBTQ Political Representation in New York Politics, where he helped conduct oral history interviews of the individuals now on stage. Before I turn it to Stephen, I want to acknowledge that this event is made possible through the generous support of the LaGuardia community and the New York City Council, in particular, the Council's LGBTQIA+ caucus. Thank you to all who have made this evening possible. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Stephen. Stephen.
Thank you, Provost Gastick-Rosado. Delighted to be here with such a stellar panel. And I want to get right into the questions. And I told the panelists that I would be asking the first question for all of you to address. And we're talking about political culture in Queens, the transformation that you helped foster these last few decades. In the 1970s, Queens was home to the fictional bigot Archie Bunker and culturally conservative white ethnic communities. In 1977, during the Democratic mayoral primary between Mario Cuomo and Ed Koch, there were signs, "Vote for Cuomo, not the homo," posted in Queens on Queens Boulevard. In 1992, the most vocal opposition to the inclusive Children of the Rainbow curriculum came from District 24 in Queens, led by School Board President Mary Cummins. Queens also witnessed the tragic homophobic murders of Julio Rivera in 1990, Edgar Garzón in 2001. And again, we're here tonight to discuss the transformation of Queens, the political and culture of Queens, and some of the work that you did to accelerate those changes. And so my first question for all the panelists, would you discuss when you first ran for office, what the climate was like in your city council districts with respect to LGBTQ politics and culture? How would you describe your opposition and your challenges, and some of the work you had to do at the grassroots level? And let's go down the line here. We'll begin with Danny, go to Jimmy, Lynn, and Tiffany. Danny?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much. Thank you, Provost, for being here. Thank you to LaGuardia Community College and to the archives, the Wagner Archives, for hosting us here tonight. You know, I came out in 1973 to my mom, and that was when homosexuality was still on the list of mental disorders. Thankfully, my mom supported me and was always there for me, as was Jimmy's mother as well. So you know, when I came out as an openly gay teacher in 1992, there were elected officials in the borough who literally would not have their picture taken with us, and that included the borough president. When we first started the Queens Pride Parade, she would not attend. She said that that a parade was no place to celebrate one's sexuality, you know, and although she was decent on legislation in terms of hate crimes and passage of civil rights legislation as well, she still would not be visible with us. And visibility is our biggest issue. You know, we are everywhere, as they like to say, but people just didn't know it. So Queens, like you said, was the home of Archie Bunker. And when I first decided to run for city council, it was after 17 years of activism in the community that made it possible for us to be able to run. Jimmy had run in 2001, I believe it was, as well. Unfortunately, he did not win at that time, but he actually ran in the district where I eventually ran and won. He won the same time, but in another district in Sunnyside. He had moved to Sunnyside by that time. But when I ran, a lot of homophobia was in the campaign. Some people, I have an arrest record. I was arrested when I was 16 years old, and I was charged with prostitution, which was a common charge used against LGBT people, particularly gay men. And so that charge came up along with 2 other charges. and they actually put literature underneath the doors of people in Left Rack City with me in a wig and a pair of high heels as if I was a prostitute, quote unquote. And so I faced a lot of homophobia. And then the guy who ran against me on the Republican line ran on an anti-marriage equality platform. So there was a lot of homophobia that was out there. Unfortunately, though, all of that stuff, my constituents put it aside. They didn't believe it. They saw beyond it. And I was elected to the city council by a 10 percentage points, and I beat an incumbent, which also was very difficult to do at that time as well. So, but I think that because we had done that other grassroots organizing, we started an organization every year after the Pride Parade. We started Queens Pride, then we started the Lesbian and Gay Democratic Club, then we started PFLAG, then we started Queens Pride House, and the list goes on and on. But because of that organizing, I think that was how we were able to change people's minds and attitudes.
First of all, thank you for mentioning my mom. Very, very sweet of you. When I came out in 1989, she was among the first people I told, and she said, "You're my son, I love you, and nothing changes." And I felt like that love allowed me to become the activist that I became and ultimately get elected. As Danny mentioned, I first ran for city council in 2001. Ironically enough, against the same person that Danny beat 8 years later. And I was in that race in 2001 in Jackson Heights, subjected to some intense homophobia. There was an anonymous hit piece that was sprinkled all over the district that mentioned that me and my husband were lovers and where we lived, and listed our address and all sorts of scurrilous lies, but it was meant to frighten people. And I remember, homophobia takes many forms, and one of my opponents in that race said, really, really, in a debate, called me Tinkerbell, right? And it was code, right? She was definitely sending a message to people that he's different, he's not like us. And I think homophobia takes many different forms. I lost that race, but I believe that every time out queer people run, we move the community forward, right? Both our community, but also acceptance and embracing from non-queer people. So all of these runs, just like David Rothenberg, who was the first out gay person to run for city council in the city, paved the way for then Tom Duane's successful run. All of these runs actually build support and build power for our community. So I lost that race in '01, and Lynn and Tiffany can vouch. It sucks to lose races in politics, but we all came back and won because queer people do not stop or give up. So 8 years later, I ran in Sunnyside. My husband, who is here, and I had moved a few blocks. The districts had changed, and I ran. In those 8 years, there was less homophobia, right? Society was changing at a very, very rapid clip. But I do remember distinctly an older Irish American woman absolutely hated me every time I would attempt to hand her a flyer, and I knew not to. But on election day, I had a really good friend of mine, Phil Velez, who you've met and know. He was flyering with me, and I saw her coming to vote at PS 11 in Woodside, and I said, "Oh my God, no." And Phil went to hand her the flyer before I could say, "No, don't do that." And she paused, and she said, "I would never vote for his gay agenda." And Phil was like, "Uh-oh." And I'm like, "Nope, don't worry about it. That's just one vote." So it was still there. It is still there. But all of us, by running, by being out, by being defiant, by being ourselves, right, we push the lever, and all of it. The activists who came before us, the activists that Danny worked with, all the people who died of AIDS and never got to see these moments, right? But all of that collective pushed all of us forward into a place where now there are a record number of out queer people in the city council, including these two amazing people next to me. And so I just feel very grateful to have been a part of this, right? To have played that role. And I know that when I got elected, I had out queer people say to me all the time, right? They'd pull you aside after an event and say, I just want to let you know, I'm really proud that my council member is gay, right? I'm really, really proud. And when I would go to my high schools for Respect for All Day, right, and you'd meet with the students, some of the students wouldn't believe that you were gay, right? That like their council member, a person in a position of power, was queer and out. And it made a big difference in their lives. And I always liked I always believe the importance of electing out queer people because of how other people perceive our community, right? I grew up at a time where the only images you saw of queer people were queer people who were being beaten up or dying, who were weak. And I wanted all people to see out queer people in positions of power, right? And so the non-queer people in the district, whether they liked it or not, had to fucking deal with us, right? And that made a big difference. And I think all of that is at the core of why it's so important for queer people to run for office and achieve these things, because it changes and continues to change our society.
So I want to thank Danny and Jimmy for being pioneers here in Queens, which is really important. I actually got involved in politics in 1977 when, during the mayoral race, I actually worked for Bella Abzug, who was one of the people who put in legislation in Congress for gay rights. And so I was exposed to that. I met somebody who was gay, who was a gay man in the campaign, who later died of AIDS, unfortunately, and I went through a lot with him. He had Kaposi sarcoma at the time, and nobody kind of knew what that was. And it was very devastating, and I helped to take care of him to some degree. And so I was just wanted, and he worked for an assemblyman. He worked for somebody named, I'm probably the oldest, yeah, I am the oldest one here. And I worked for an assemblyman. He worked for an assemblyman, and he brought me into the office, who put in for the first gay rights legislation in Albany, who was Assemblyman Passanante. And that was considered, oh, like you can't do that and all that. So I was really involved from very early on. My first time I ran was in 2001. I had a partner back then. She's since passed away, who was my life partner. And so we did a lot of stuff together. And 2001 was okay when I ran, but in 2009, I really got hit with a backlash, because I think it was because I was getting close to being a real candidate, a real contender. And so what happened was there was a whispering campaign that I was a lesbian, people shouldn't vote for me. I got hate mail. I had to go to the police precinct and report it. I got, those things that you see on TV where somebody cuts out the pieces of the words and stuff from a magazine and stuff and threatened me. So that was really scary. And but we moved forward, and in 2009 I lost by less than 300 votes, which was really difficult. And but I just kept going. In the interim, my partner passed away, and I decided just to keep going, and because I think representation is really important. I'm very proud of the fact, and I'm proud to serve with Tiffany, by the way, but I'm very proud of the fact that I'm the first Jewish lesbian in the city council. And it's difficult. I will tell you, even though it gets better in this last race, so a large part of my district, I represent Forest Hills, Regal Park, and Kew Gardens, and a piece of Richmond Hill. There's a big Orthodox Jewish population, and one of the candidates running against me was an Orthodox gentleman who would go out in his community and say, you can't vote for Lynn Schulman because she's a lesbian. And it was really difficult for me. And I just want to tell you how things have changed in a positive way. So there was a woman in the Orthodox community, and it's not common for women to be in positions of influence, but there are some, who was very prominent in the community, and she pushed back. I didn't know this until later on. She pushed back with him and came out and actually at the end supported me. And so that was a really big deal at the time. And so she galvanized people around me, and these were people who were her friends, and she decided that it was more important to support me and who I was, so I was very happy about that. And, you know, I've been able to do a lot in the council. We have the largest LGBTQIA+ caucus that there's ever been in the city council now, and we're hoping, you know, to grow that at some point. And I'm really proud of who I am. I'm proud of the people that I serve with and the people who've come before me. So thank you.
So first of all, thank you. I really appreciate being able to be in community and conversation. Can folks hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Before, I want to hit two pieces to directly respond to your question, but I would be a terrible elected if I didn't take the quick opportunity, because halt solitary was mentioned twice already. And I just want y'all to know that, like, we are very, very close. We want to get it to a vote. We want to make sure it's a super majority so that the mayor can't veto it. As a former public defender, I can tell you that there are a disproportionate number of queer folks that are languishing in solitary confinement conditions. It might not be in the solitary confinement unit, but the conditions are there, whether they call it protective custody or something else. So call your council members and tell them to sign on if they aren't. That's my plug. And also,
I'm a sponsor, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you for the work that you have done on that. I'm going to take like a little bit of a different approach to answering your question. You know, they've offered so much information around their experiences running in relationship to constituencies. But I want to talk a little bit about the sort of the challenges of being a queer person, being a queer person of color in a political space as a newcomer, as an outsider, and then also sort of transition into what it looks like to govern as a queer person of color and the challenges there, because even as you hear everybody's stories, you can tell that there has been a lot of progress, but at the same time, there's still so much more that needs to be addressed and talked about. You know, I think something that we all can relate to as members of, you know, the alphabet mafia is that, you know, the way that we have found survival, no matter what generation, is through community, is through finding each other and hanging on really tight to each other. And so when we enter new spaces that we don't have experience with, we try to find our people, right? And so when I ran for district attorney back in 2019, had never touched electoral politics. It was like a crazy thing that my homegirls convinced me to do, but ultimately like I really believed in. And one of the first things I tried to do was like find my people. And it was like really, really difficult to try to navigate political spaces, which are a microcosm of like what the rest of our society looks like, and understand that the same powers and hierarchies still exist. And it was really hard to enter some spaces and, you know, feel like I wasn't quite welcome or part of that community, because the reality is that in a lot of spaces they are still dominated by majority cisgendered white men. And there's a gap there in terms of the leadership of Black and brown queer folks and the inclusion, right? Like the true inclusion of Black and brown queer folks. And that was like difficult and something that still gets navigated. And then sort of pivoting to like, well, what does it mean now to govern in this space? Because I will say, I entered every space from then until now, leading with, you know, my name is Tiffany Caban, and I am a queer Latina. I'm a queer Latina. I'm a queer Latina. Like, you're going to hear it 30 million times because it matters. It matters so much. And I knew that it mattered, especially when I had folks of our community come up to me and tell me that it mattered. When I had young kids telling me that it mattered. When I had parents crying, telling me that it mattered. But it also matters for power building, right? Like our people will only be served by dominant institutions if we are in the roles and able to influence and decision make in those dominant institutions like government. But to govern as a queer person, it's been difficult in this moment, like real talk. Like, yes, we can say there's more of us than ever, and that's a beautiful thing, but what we are seeing in this moment too is an increase in political violence. There was like recently a study done on the federal level with federal electeds that really honed in on particularly women of color, but they showed a drastic increase in political violence. And it's becoming normal. It's becoming normative where people are like, well, you signed up for it. No, we did not. We did not sign up for this kind of violence, this kind of rhetoric that incites violence, and we're seeing it more and more. And it's something I've experienced recently. You know, I had on primetime national Fox News, under my face up there, under a ticker that said, "Queer abolitionist, council member hates cops," and I wear the title of queer abolitionist with a lot of pride. But to know that, like, in that context, what it was meant to do was to stoke fear and violence, and it's exactly what it did, because we got a deluge from all around the country of death threats, all kinds of things that ended up interrupting our ability to deliver constituent services more quickly and effectively. But just to understand that, like, there are things happening in this moment, and progress is not linear. They run on parallel tracks. While we are on a track of liberation, of equity, of being able to allow our people and all people to thrive, there are people that are on a parallel track that are going to continue to fight to oppress, right? To marginalize, to maintain systems of status quo in terms of power structures. And we have to remember that. And we experience that in the body. I mean, we have had some of our Republican colleagues call us groomers.
Yeah.
And like that is truly violent and terrible. So just to understand that, like, yeah, we've made a lot of progress, but we are also very much so in the thick of a very real fight for our dignity, our liberation, and for me, governing in this moment really needs to be centered on making sure that, like, we are out there, particularly for Black and brown trans folks and gender nonconforming folks.
Thank you for your responses and the reminder that progress is not linear. And it all reminded me that, in fact, the first two Queens natives, out gay and lesbian, elected to office were Deborah Glick and Tom Duane. They were born and raised in Queens, but they moved in the 1970s. Deborah moved to Lower Manhattan, the Village, Tom to Chelsea. Deborah won to State Assembly in 1990, Tom, City Council in 1991. And I would have to say that they would not have won in Queens in the early 90s. I can't imagine it. And it's good. I want to now address particular questions to each panelist. And Jimmy, a segue to something you talked about. You were the first out gay city council member in your district. You won in 2009. Would you talk about how do you think your victory and your election impacted your constituents, both LGBTQ+ and heterosexual alike? What did it change? And could a straight ally have been just as effective?
No. No. It makes a difference, right? Representation makes a difference. And it's very powerful for everyone. So, my husband and I, we live in Sunnyside. We like to think that while Jackson Heights gets all the rave for being one of the gayest neighborhoods in Queens, and Astoria, incredibly gay as well, Sunnyside has become this incredibly queer place, right? And an incredibly queer, friendly, and safe space. I genuinely believe that when the council member or elected official representing an area is gay, it sends a signal, right? Where if a young couple or someone is looking to where to rent an apartment, they're like, oh, there's like a gay council member? It must be a really cool neighborhood, right? It must be like really cool because they're electing out queer people. And for the folks who are there, it sends a real powerful message, right? If you're walking down the street you're walking down the street, I hope, a little bit more proudly, right? A little bit more forcefully, like, this is our neighborhood, right? Like, we live here. We always lived here, right? We always had the right to be here safe and as we are, but it is a very powerful thing to have an out queer elected official. And so I'm really, really proud of that. I think we made Sunnyside gayer, and I really, really, I love that, right? It's just amazing.
Thank you. Lynn, you currently serve as health chair in Committee of Health in City Council. Would you discuss your work with New York City Health and Hospitals on LGBTQIA+ issues?
Well, it's actually with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, because there is a hospitals committee that deals with H&H, although I deal with them tangentially. But so what we did with monkeypox is that we had, so the city council had a forum right away with a number of groups and with the caucus members. And so we wanted to get the facts out. I will tell you, dealing with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, that there were a lot of glitches in the very beginning, but they were, I mean, they were a little bit slow, and but they were responsive in the sense that I kept pushing them and pushing them. I would actually call the commissioner on his cell on the weekends and the staff and say, hey, like, this is happening, why are you doing this? Like, we need to get stuff out, we need to be more equitable, all of that information. And so eventually it got turned around, and also, you know, there was messaging we did. So the council has always, I worked in the city council on the staff side before becoming an elected official, and I worked in the speaker's office, and we always had what's called days of service. So, like, for example, today was Domestic Violence Day, so people wear purple, and our staffs, us and our staffs went out and handed out leaflets and things like that. The city council never had a night of action, never had a night of action, and I proposed to the speaker that we do a night of action where we go to venues to LGBTQIA+ venues throughout the city, hand out information. And so I went, so we actually, it was great because City Hall offered up, the Office of Nightlife worked with us, the Mayor's Office of Nightlife, and so I and another council member and some staff went to some venues in Jackson Heights, and the commissioner came out. I asked that the commissioner come out with us, and we actually had some news media attention for that, which helped to elevate the issue, and so that was very helpful. And but what Jimmy was saying is that representation does matter, because an ally couldn't do that. I, as somebody from the community, could push and say, hey, we need this. Like, this is really important. This is what's going on. I had constituents call me to tell me what was going on. You know, the best thing out of all of this was that I had a couple of, now I want to just say, my other three colleagues here live in more progressive neighborhoods, I want to say, because just to give you a sense, my assembly district in my city council district went for Curtis Lewa in the mayoral election. And there's a lot of Republican base there. And so my pushing some of these issues there is harder, but that means I have to just work more at it. And so what I wanted to say is that I was somebody in that context. We have a lot more LGBTQIA+ individuals moving into the district, and somebody stopped me one day, I won't forget this, several weeks ago, and said, oh, are you Councilmember Schulman? I said yes, and I wasn't clear what he wanted. He said, I want to thank you so much for getting me my monkeypox vaccine, and I'm so grateful for you, and can I take a selfie with you? I want to put up on social media. And so the things we do are for people in the district to make sure that they have better lives and that they have access, because, you know, that's the other thing, is there's not a lot of access to health care for women, and for LGBTQIA+ individuals, there really isn't. And so I'm trying to push on that, because my philosophy and my goal is to make sure that everybody, no matter what zip code that you live in, have access to affordable and quality health care.
Tiffany, before you were elected to City Council in 2021, you served as a public defender for 7 years and became a champion of the decriminalization of sex work. Would you discuss your views on this issue and in particular on LGBTQ plus sex workers?
Yeah, I mean, the short version is sex work is work, and we need to decriminalize it. And I think, you know, at any given moment, I am trying to locate myself within movement, right? Within the context of, are we moving towards building out the world that we want to live in? And you can move into different spaces in that, right? Like, I have served as a public defender, I have been a political organizer, I am serving as an elected official, but like those are tools in a toolbox, those are strategies in a broader movement. And I can say that the sex work community, and particularly the organized sex work community, I can tell you, models some of the most beautiful, pure movement principles that I have ever come into contact with. And I have worked with lots of different folks in lots of different spaces. It is just a beautiful place to be. And it's really powerful. But I want to tell like a short story of kind of sort of some of my first connections to the sex work community as a public defender. You know, I represented, well over 1,000 clients, folks incarcerated on Rikers Island, and, my queer clients always were just like, but I remember one particular, and I have so many stories, but one in particular where I represented this woman, she was a trans woman, and she was incarcerated because she could not afford her bail. And you get a court date every, several weeks, maybe even a couple months apart. And she had her court date, and the way that it works is that you get produced into a courthouse, right? And then a courtroom, and I can go visit you in the back in these like little cells. They're cages that then have like little booths. And so I'm sitting there behind the court room, and my client walks into it, and she sits down, and behind her, what I can see through the cage is she's in Gen Pop with men. And so there's a big group of men behind her, and clearly just like really, really, she was really struggling. And here was this woman sitting in front of me, growing facial hair for the first time in several years because she wasn't getting access to her hormone therapy. And I could see and feel the fear, the trauma, the stress, and this is what our system does. And she was there in connection to charges related to sex work and some other things. And that was like my first kind of introduction to some of the community and the organizing. But when we get down, like, and then if you sort of shift and move into the issue itself, I mean, we have to acknowledge the fact that street economies, right, and sex work are the inevitable result of systems that marginalize and exploit and shut people out, right? Sex work and survival sex work is the function of barriers to access to housing, to healthcare, to like gainful employment and sort of like what we recognize as like mainstream economy. And so we drive people into this so that they can survive, so that they can put food on their table. And then we criminalize it and make it very dangerous for folks to do that. We send them to jails and prisons. And so just recognizing that this is absolutely a human rights issue. And if we are also, and, I think some of the backlash against it as well, we have to tackle trafficking. Well, the reality is that if we actually want to better target true trafficking, then we have to decriminalize sex work, because sex workers are the key to being able to traffic, to catch trafficking. It's the difference between driving it further underground, right? Like, we make it less safe for sex workers to be able to vet their clients so that they aren't harmed while they're doing their work. By decriminalizing, we make it safer to report to folks. We make it safer for them to relay information in instances of trafficking. Like, this is a human rights issue, it is a public health issue, and it's just outcome driven. We just need to take care of and support people and meet them where they're at and listen to what they're saying. And they're saying we need to decriminalize sex work, so it's exactly what we need to do. And it's an incredibly important thing to do. I don't know if you had another part of your question besides sort of like why
No, I think you really
my
articulately...
ADHD is like coming out.
Attract-
I don't remember if there was a second part.
Pardon me?
I don't remember if there
Oh,
was a
no,
second part
about
to your question.
LGBTQ sex workers
Yeah.
in particular.
Yeah, I mean, we have such a beautiful, vibrant, community, especially in Jackson Heights, of Latinx sex workers, and also, groups of migrant sex workers, right? Asian migrant sex workers that are working in our massage parlors. And again, like, we just need to support people's survival and then fight for the infrastructure and access to all of the things that, like, quite frankly, we have had the privilege of being able to access.
Danny, you introduced legislation to create the city's first government-issued photo identification card called ID NYC. It was passed by City Council. Mayor Bill de Blasio signed it into law. In what ways does the ID NYC card benefit the LGBTQ plus community?
Sure. Before I start, I also just want to thank Tiffany for the work that she's doing with sex workers. When I was arrested for prostitution, I was 16 years old, and that was something that had followed me through my whole life. When I went to apply for a job at an insurance company, they wanted to bond me, and it came up. They didn't want me working for that company. When I went to work for the Department of Education, it came up again. They did the fingerprints, and I had to go down and be tape recorded and explain what had happened. I was 16 years old, et cetera, so forth and so on. And when I ran for city council, it was all over the newspapers again. So the criminalization of sex work is something that's really important and personal to me. So thank you for the work that you're doing around that issue, and continue to do around that issue. I really appreciate it. Just to go back to what you were talking about with ID NYC. So, I represent Jackson Heights, and that's probably one of the most diverse communities in the whole world, literally. They say there's 167 different languages spoken in my neighborhood. And I realized that you can't do anything in New York City, especially after 9/11, to get into a building, to go pick up your child from school or whatever it may be, unless you have a piece of identification. And our immigrant communities, particularly the undocumented in Jackson Heights, and that's throughout the whole city, throughout the whole country actually, lack that identification. So when I was chair of the Immigration Committee, my first term, it's something that I wanted to move forward, but we were a little bit hesitant to move it forward because it was during the Bloomberg administration. And while Bloomberg was good about cultural affairs and cultural clothing and things like that, he was really not good on real immigrant issues, the real nuts and bolts of immigrant issues. So we decided to hold off, and then we watched and saw what happened with the mayoral election. De Blasio got elected. I had my legislation in the council. I moved that forward with the support of Speaker Melissa Mark Viverito, and that legislation is something that was really important. I think there's over 1.3 million people now, 1.3 million who have ID NYC, and that gives them the identification that they need to open bank accounts or savings accounts, particularly at credit unions and things like that, and also to be able just to get into buildings and into schools to pick up their children. But one of the issues that we had with that was that we did not want it to be subject to administrative subpoenas, because we were afraid that the police department would come in and try to identify who those undocumented folks were. And so that's another reason why we kind of waited until de Blasio came in, and then I was able to argue that only under a judicial subpoena would any of that information be available. And besides that, it'd be very difficult to determine who was undocumented, who was not documented, who is documented, who is not documented, even with the judicial subpoenas, that we felt that we protected that undocumented community. And in fact, that was true, and it happened because Representative Nicole Maliotakis, who was an assemblywoman at the time, brought a lawsuit and tried to gain that information, and she was denied by the courts to have access to any of that information. And so that was something that I was really proud of. There are several pieces of legislation that also, and the intersectionality of that ID NYC was that you did not have to have a gender marker on it, a gender identification. I went to test it. And they did not ask me what I wanted, and they just assumed that I was male. They put it down, but unfortunately, I got a hold of the commissioner. I was able to tell them, no, I did not want a marker on my IDNYC. And that was the first time that had ever happened, I think, in any municipality in the United States, as a matter of fact. And just going back to the issues that Tiffany was also talking about, in terms of the violence and the calls, et cetera, that people get, when I would put anything about immigrant issues or LGBTQ issues in my newsletter, I would get those violent telephone calls. And we had one that was called the groveler, and he'd always go off. I had bomb threats at my office, and it was always around the inclusion of LGBT and immigrant issues, or the combination thereof. So that was something really important. Just to go also, removing ICE from Rikers Island was something that was really important to me as well. We worked with Melissa Mark Viverito, and we were successful in doing that. I remember going into the Bloomberg administration, and they laughed at us. You're never going to be able to get ICE off of Rikers Island. Of course, ICE was feeding undocumented folks who were accused of minor crimes, oftentimes just misdemeanors, prostitution being one of the things that prevented folks from, getting, a citizenship here. So that was another piece of legislation that I was really proud of, and the intersectionality of that, because so many of those folks who were facing those types of charges were folks that lived in my community in Jackson Heights, LGBT folks, transgender folks in particular. And Tiffany mentioned our large transgender community in Jackson Heights, who have borne the brunt of an awful lot of this that's gone on. So IDNYC is probably one of the things I'm most proudest of, having done, in addition to the criminal justice reform stuff that we did as well. Maybe I'll have an opportunity to speak a little bit more about that later on.
It's a good segue to a question I have for Tiffany. And Tiffany, as you know, in the last several years, there's been an increase in attacks on trans women of color in particular here in New York City and indeed throughout the nation. And in a recent interview with City and State, you and Crystal Hudson, your co-chair of the LGBTQI caucus in City Council, spoke about focusing on the most marginalized within the community. So what can be done to address this problem, the increasing attacks on trans women of color?
I mean, that's a big question, and there's a lot that can be done, and it starts on the very basic level of every single member of our community has a role to play in decreasing the violence against Black and brown trans folks, particularly. And we're seeing it now, right? Across the country, we're seeing trans and gender nonconforming children being attacked, being subjected to genital inspection regimes. We are seeing crises of gender-based violence. And I have a really good friend, her name is Joanna Cifredo, who is this incredible trans activist in Puerto Rico, who last year, for her 35th birthday, did a walk around the entire island to raise awareness, because I don't know if a lot of you know, but there is a gender violence crisis on the island, in addition to a lot of other crises. And there actually really aren't very many documented people on the island who are trans who have lived past the age of 35. And so that was a really big marker and turning point for her. But the significance of that is that as a community, I sit here and look at just the difference in the decades that we have come up through, right? And us sharing our stories. And that is critical to our survival and to our ability to grow and thrive. And so our number one goal should be keeping people alive long enough to become our ancestors, to teach us things, so that we are not starting from scratch over and over again. That's really powerful. And we could do that at our kitchen tables. We could do that in the organizations we're involved in. Everywhere you can, center and dignify and uplift and affirm and be led by Black and brown trans folks. There are so many Black and brown trans-led organizations. We've got New Pride Agenda. We have Transgendo Colectivo in Jackson Heights. Make the Road has their TGN CIQ project. We have the Oprah Project. I mean, there are just so many. Engage in mutual aid. When you see folks out there saying, we have this, Black trans comrade that is looking for housing, needs help, we're collecting money, go give a few dollars. Mutual aid is a really, really important part of all of the work that we're doing, and then just foster spaces and be unapologetic about standing with and loving your Black and brown, trans friends, family, and neighbors. And you can do it in a million different ways. We all have a role to play. You know, I remember going back to that first run for office in 2019 in the DA's race. There came a point in the campaign where my congresswoman endorsed, and it was like all back to back. Like the Congresswoman, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, New York Times. But when Alexandria endorsed, we had already had the next day planned a sex worker day of action. Sex workers were organized and they wanted to do this day of action on behalf of the campaign, many of which were undocumented and couldn't vote, but they wanted to make sure that people were looking out for them and their interests, and their voices were going to be seen and heard. And so all of these cameras were going to come the next day to cover my campaign that like just was like this David and Goliath situation. We had not gotten that kind of attention. And I got a lot of advice from people to say, well, make sure you focus on talking about this. Don't talk about what this is. Like, don't, like, you're going to lose people centering that. And so as soon as the cameras showed up and they hit record, they were like, hey, you know, what's going on here? I was like, well, I'm Tiffany Caban. I'm a queer Latina running for district attorney, and we are having a sex worker day of action, and let's talk about decriminalizing sex work, right? And like being unafraid to do those things. We need people to be bold and brave and stand up, because real talk, and this is the last thing I will say, is that is the least that we can do, because in all of our big fights and all of our liberation struggles, when we talk about the queer community, it has been Black and brown trans folks, the people on the margins of the margins, who have been at the forefront, who have been the ones who have most clearly put their bodies on the line, even though when we have those fights, the people who most benefit from the results of those fights continue to be white, cisgendered, gay and lesbian folks. And still, our Black and brown trans siblings are out there like having that fight for all of us. And so we need to show the fuck up, is what I will say.
Jimmy, as council member, you helped fund Drag Story Hour. Recently, Queens Council member Vicky Palladino criticized the program, and last month, protesters and counter-protesters gathered at a Drag Story Hour at Elmhurst Public Library. And just a few days ago, bigots chalked up the sidewalk of Queens Council member Shekhar Krishnan. Would you talk about why you support the program?
So there's an element where it's almost comical, right, that Councilmember Palladino would go after Drag Queen Story Hour. But, and it's outrageous, and it's disgusting. But as Tiffany alluded to earlier, it's actually part of a bigger movement and backlash against the progress we've been making. That is growing. It is not diminishing. It is growing. As you just indicated, they are becoming bolder, more aggressive, more violent, right? These are amazing educational programs that I was very proud to bring to my district. The first one I ever did was in the library that I went to as a child, the Broadway Library in Astoria, right off of Steinway Street, right? And it's in those spaces that children are discovering who they are, but also who other people are, and how we treat other people, right? And so the first place I did it with Bella Noche, who's an incredible drag queen and performer, I went, and I remember being a little bit nervous about like how it would be received, right? And that was my own stuff, right, coming up. And I remember we got there and it was packed, right? The children's room that I grew up in was packed with parents and caregivers and children who just had so much fun. It was so beautiful. And I remember seeing a family, there was a dad and a mom. The dad was really hot, can I just say? and he was like totally buff and muscular and everything like that. And they had a little son and a little daughter. And the kids were just loving it. And afterwards, for some reason I looked, well, it's not for some reason, I looked at him during the program. But I was wondering how, like, Dad was also receiving this, and after the ceremony, Bella Noche said, anyone who wants to, like, do a photo op, like, come up, and the family, like, rushed up, you know, and there was this, like, big muscle dad, like, with his son and daughter and mom, and they loved Bella. It's an amazing program. So for Councilmember Palladino to go after it, is to go after all of us, right? Is to go after the safety of all children, right? Because if you threaten Drag Queen Story Hour, if you show up and protest, right, you are making all of us fearful of being who we are, but also showing the compassion and the love that we should be showing for everybody. And it is something that all of us have to be very, very vocal about. And if they come for us, we have to push back, right? We have to defend Drag Queen Story Hour, fund Drag Queen Story Hour, support it, go to it, and make sure that it is available in every public library, in every public school, everywhere, right, where there are children, because wherever there are children, there are people who are going to be adults, right, who are going to decide how we're all treated and who has space to be who they are. So Drag Queen Story Hour, some people think it's not that important, right, and maybe it's this cute little program, but it's actually transformational. And in that sense, Vicky Palladino is correct, right? We are changing the world through all of these acts, but for the better, not in the way that she sees it or the way these other folks would see it. We have to call violence, violence, right? It is not just protest. If you show up at a library and you storm and you threaten the staff, you are engaging in criminal violent activity. If you are terrifying children, if you are vilifying drag queens, you are committing an act of violence. So I urge all of us, support Drag Queen Story Hour, because it is everything that is fundamentally right about how we should be educating young people about who they are, who other people are, and how we should be coming together to treat people, all people, with respect, dignity, love, and embracing difference of every kind. So I'm really proud that we did that program.
If I can just add to that two things. One is that the city council, as a body, put money into Drag Queen Story Hour. So I want to say that, and all the Republicans voted for that budget. So just want to make that clear. And us as, I as an individual council member, I don't know, I presume you did, yeah, funded it as well. And, listen, if elected officials, we could disagree with each other, and that's fine. And if they don't want to do something in their community, that's fine. But when they start coming after us and they start saying, like, we're doing stuff like, Tiffany used the word groomer, when they start calling all of us groomers, and what they do is they attract the most angry and violent people by doing that. And now, when we have social media now, the social media really wasn't around way back when, even in 2009 when I last ran. So it's much more promulgated now, and people feel that it's okay to create violence on these social media platforms. And so I will tell you that so I responded back at one point to something that the council member had said, Palladino. Within a half hour, I got 200 tweets back threatening me. And it was really dismaying to me. It was very upsetting. And it kept up for several days. Because these were people not just from here. These were people from all over the country, and these were people from all over the world that have this mindset, and they just wanted to attack. And that's wrong. That's wrong to create an atmosphere for that.
Thank you. In fact, we at LaGuardia and Wagner Archives have the drum collection. We also have the Van Bramer collection, and there's a folder in your collection, hate mail that you received during the Children of the Rainbow curriculum controversy of 1992. There's also supportive letters that you received as well, but it's something we draw attention to as we use it in the classroom to inform our students. And
Just if I may say also on the Drag Queen Story Hour, when they first came to me, I was the chair of the finance committee in the city council. And I just thought that everything that Jimmy said was so really true, that they are probably the most marginalized people, even sometimes within the LGBT community. You know, it used to be like, don't put drag queens in the front of the parade, because if you put drag queens in the front of the parade, everybody's going to think we're all a bunch of drag queens, et cetera, so forth and so on. And they have been the people who have been left behind, really, in the whole movement. So I was really interested in doing that as the finance chair. And as the finance chair, with the power of the purse, I actually didn't even want the finance chair position. Corey Johnson convinced me to take it, and I saw the power of the purse and be able to fund programs like this to create the LGBT community services program, to create this program, as a matter of fact, that we were able to do in the city council, and to put a liaison in the Department of Education. But what Vicky Palladino and the folks like that see is what Jimmy was alluding to before, all of us, I think, have been speaking about, is having elected gay officials in office being able to provide this type of funding. That's the power. That's what they are really afraid of, is that we are going to create this change now that we are in power.
Yes, and in fact, could you just elaborate a little bit? Your third term, you were finance chair and helped fund LGBTQ organizations, and indeed the program what we're doing here at LaGuardia. Just a little bit more about that and the significance of that, because I don't know if many folks have insight into the budget process. I mean, we hear major issues about defunding the police a couple of years ago, but not all the measures. So could you just say a little bit more about the importance of being finance chair and funding LGBTQ organizations?
Well, the primary responsibility of a city council member, according to the city charter, is to produce the city's budget annually. So, I was given this opportunity to be chair of the finance committee, and I said to Corey, we don't have LGBT curriculum resources. We need that. We don't have a fund or initiative dedicated solely to LGBT community services. We don't have a trans equity fund initiative dedicated just to transgender folks. None of this was in the budget, okay, until about 5 or so years ago. And so I was able to create those things along with Speaker Johnson, and we were able to fund them. I think at this point, we're probably close to about $50 million in funding that has gone out to various LGBTQ organizations since we started those initiatives. And LaGuardia got, just this past year, $1.1 million, which I'm very proud of. We were also able to work with the administration to put money into the LaGuardia program, and also to commit to the programs, and this is really important to me, to commit to the programs that are in the Department of Education, because we need to really work with our youth. We need to have our youth, as young as kindergarten, pre-K, whenever, from birth on, they need to know that LGBTQ people exist, that we are your family, your friends, and your neighbors, and that the Department of Education is going to be there to support us. There are still teachers and principals who are afraid of the backlash that Vicky Palladino talked about. She said, I'm not going to have Drag Queen Story Hour in any of my schools, you know? Oh, no, you are. And if you continue that type of language, that is a violation of the New York City Human Rights Code based on gender identity and nonconforming people. So we have to continue to push back, we have to fight, and one way to do that is with the power of the purse, and that is something I'm really proud of having been able to do when I was chair of the Finance Committee.
Before we do a brief audience Q&A, Lynn, can I follow up about the monkeypox virus and what City Council, would you elaborate a little bit on what City Council has done to combat the outbreak and what is being done to prepare for future infectious disease outbreaks?
Well, the second part is a really good question and a larger question. But in terms of monkeypox, as I had said earlier, we had a forum with community-based organizations. We did outreach with them. We worked with the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene to make sure that they had materials that were, that were in different languages and that kind of thing, and made sure, the website wasn't working so well, so we had to make sure that happened. We also introduced, and Tiffany was part of that, the caucus introduced a package of legislation around that. So that was something that was really important, and we introduced that a while back. So in terms of outbreaks, we don't have a real coordinated health system in New York. We have a hospital system, but we don't have a real coordinated healthcare system. It's one of the things as health chair that I'm trying to pull together. And we're not prepared for the next pandemic. I actually am having a hearing on November 1st about COVID and where we are because, you know, it's not, I mean, it's still here, and, you know, there are other variants, and I just, by the way, I want to encourage people to get your first booster. If you haven't gotten vaccinated, get vaccinated, get booster. I just had my second booster recently. And it's really important for us to be prepared to, you know, one of the pieces of legislation that I've put in for that's being formulated by the legal team is to have an office of preparedness around public health. There's legislation to do an office to work around pandemics, but I'm talking about public health emergencies. If you read the newspapers, you'll see in Uganda, Ebola is starting to come up again. We had a polio issue. Who thought we would have that in this day and age? So there are all of these kind of issues coming up, and we have to, the United States, so the one thing I want to say about monkeypox too is that while New York had some issues and everything else, there was fairly responsive, but the federal government is horrible. They were horrible. You know, I've dedicated my professional and personal life to healthcare advocacy. I was born out of, as you mentioned, the HIV/AIDS movement, where I saw friends and neighbors die needlessly because of those in power just didn't care. And so we kind of saw the same thing with COVID, started to see the same thing with monkeypox. The CDC wasn't prepared for it. I wrote a letter to the CDC about making sure we had vaccines. There were vaccines sitting overseas that expired, like 2 million vaccines. It was terrible. So the United States doesn't do, like Europe does more in terms of following these kinds of things and trends and test and all of that. So hopefully we're going to try to get that together. I've been talking to Senator Schumer's office and others in the state legislature. So we really have to come around that to make sure that we don't, that we're prepared if something like that comes up, because we weren't.
I've been handed a couple of questions from audience members, and I do want to emphasize that many in our audience are LaGuardia students. We also have faculty and staff and other folks from off the campus. So welcome to everybody, and those of you viewing online too. This is for the current council members, Caban and Schulman. How is the LGBTQ plus caucus addressing the services needed by the LGBTQ plus migrants coming to New York City?
I know you're asking that of me. Tiffany is actually the co-chair of the caucus, so I'm going to pass that to her.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really acute crisis, right? And it's sort of a similar approach that we have been taking, and actually something I probably could have added to one of the questions you asked me earlier, of like taking every single problem, crisis situation we have and making sure that we are accounting for our community, right? We see it in our homelessness crisis. Well, do we have dedicated beds and spaces for queer folks? We don't have enough of them, right? You know, in terms of transitional housing and like all of these different spaces, do we have, and I know Elmhurst Hospital is, thanks to federal grant money and other pieces, getting like a new wing that is for women's health, but is also going to be like really dedicated to gender affirming care and other health issues that are particular to the queer community, right? And so understanding that we have a ton of asylum seekers who have a lot of really, really basic needs. And the reality is that we're seeing that those needs have to be met first. I was actually having a conversation with somebody about this earlier because we were doing work around Go Purple Day, right? Domestic violence awareness, and we were telling our constituents about what city resources are available and started having a conversation around asylum seekers and how they're trying to go in and talk to folks about domestic violence resources as an example. But the reality is that first and foremost in this moment, before people are even ready or willing to access really particularized supports or care, we've got to take care of shelter, clothing, and food across the board. And then people are really able to engage in some of these other broader, more issues that folks are facing. And so, when we are talking about advocacy around that, we're going to organizations, we're talking to city agencies to say, like, are you covering your bases in terms of community, like cultural competency, and meeting community needs? Are you accounting for the fact that there are, queer folks that are part of this, and like, what are they going to need? And let's be ready to deliver it.
So,
If I was going
Oh,
to say,
and-
just on the issue of the undocumented immigrants or those who are coming here for asylum for whatever reason they're here, one of the best things that, one of the easiest things for LGBT people who often do not get identified, though, is that if they can apply for asylum here in New York City, okay, in federal courts here in New York City, they're more likely to get it than any other place in the world. So what we have to do, and I am not allowed to lobby council members, but I will say this, looking the other way, is that we have to ensure that the funding is there for legal representation for these thousands upon thousands of migrants who have come to the city to make sure that they get that support as we're moving
yeah,
forward.
and I want to add, so the Speaker of the City Council recently had a roundtable with community-based organizations in the LGBTQIA+ space, and one of the issues that came up was the shelter system, because the shelter system is really horrible and for everybody, but it's particularly bad for those who are LGBTQIA+ because they get assaulted and all kinds of things happen. So one of the ideas that came up there was to maybe have separate shelter spaces for LGBTQIA+ individuals that came from the organizations. And so, that's something that I think that we're going to take a look at and see how we can be helpful. That the issue of the asylum seekers, particularly LGBTQIA did come up, and we're going to see if there's some things we could do around that. And we did ask the organizations to come up and send ideas to us to see what we can do.
Thank you. Here's another big question from the audience. I love this. What advice can you give LGBTQ students who want to get active in politics?
Get an internship in your local council member's office if you can. Go to your council member. Don't be afraid to walk in the door, get to know them, question them, to attend club meetings, Democratic club meetings, or whatever other interest group you might be interested in. I didn't think that elected officials were approachable when I was younger, and I didn't really have a need to really visit them. But just go and do it and sit in these meetings and raise your hand and make a scene, join protests, etc. That's how you can get involved politically.
I would say organize, right? And find the issues that you're passionate about and then dive in, right? Just dive in and do the work. I was an organizer. I think we were all organizers before we were elected officials. And it's that kind of movement and mission-driven work that everybody should be engaged in. And if your life goes toward electoral politics, the things that you learn as an organizer are essential, I think, to making you a different kind of elected official, right? One that doesn't come up through the party apparatus, or someone who was gifted their seat, right? All of us had to work and organize and fight like hell for the seats that we occupied and they occupy today. And also, I came out in 1989 and I volunteered for an out gay candidate that summer before I'd even told my mother I was gay. I remember handing out flyers for Dave Taylor because the second time I ever went to a gay youth group, they played The Life and Times of Harvey Milk, the documentary that won the Academy Award. And I had never, ever seen queer people fight back. I had never seen queer people, revolt, and to seeing queer people get elected, run for office and get elected and involved in that kind of power building. And it changed my life. So I volunteered for Dave Taylor for City Council in 1989. And I remember he was coaching me on how to come out to my family as we were passing out flyers in front of supermarkets on the Upper West Side. And Dave lost that race. But again, as I said earlier, all of this is incremental. All of this adds up. and helps to build power for our community. So I just think getting involved, being an organizer, and hitting the streets and hitting the pavement and hitting the lines, getting arrested, doing civil disobedience when it matters, when people's lives are on the line, we should all be doing that work.
Can I piggyback, because I want to like directly piggyback on what Jimmy said and be like, get in where you fit in. There are a million on-ramps, and you don't have to like map out this like very clear trajectory. I think there has to be like fire and joy. Like the work that you do has to breathe some life into you, especially when what you want to do is serve, right? And then the other thing too, which is, and I think that there's like, in my mind, if we are going to build the world that provides our people with the dignity that we deserve, that provides our people with the opportunities that we deserve, that provides our people with futures where we are not just surviving, but we are like living joyful, loving lives, we have to do it differently. And so getting that experience in communities, plugging into organizations, and building a base of and a network of shared power that is outside of the institution. Because I will tell you, coming in as an elected official, I get to like be brave and do the hard thing and take the hard vote because my power doesn't come from the institutional power, from like the people or the other electeds that have amassed this internal power. My power, my base of power comes from the people, right? And it is like it's like an opposing force that allows me to do different things. And so if your goal is to serve in an elected capacity because you are fighting for our collective liberation, then I think it is absolutely critical that you are understanding that your support and your base of power has to come from outside institutions and people, and not from internal politicking. Although you will do the internal politicking when you're in the job, because that's just like a reality. But I think that is so important. And then just be open to opportunities. Like I knew going into law school that I wanted to be a public defender. I knew that that's the work that I wanted to do. But working specifically in a criminal defense practice was like my last internship. I just wanted to help people. A lot of it had to do with wanting to have reparative experiences around my own trauma, but like my first legal internship was doing VAWAs and U visas for undocumented survivors of domestic violence. And then my second was doing government benefits work for seniors who needed help with SCREE and DREE and all these other things. And then I did integrated domestic violence work, which is the intersection of criminal defense and family defense in courts. And then I did, like the sort of traditional internship in a public defense office. And so just like find the work that speaks to you, makes you feel good, makes you feel like you are helping your community, and it is all critical and relevant experience. I didn't do the traditional intern in political spaces, but I can tell you, I tell everybody who will listen, the thing that prepared me for this job in politics more than anything, quite honestly, was being a public defender.
So what I'm going to say is that I think that it's also, I think you need to figure out what's best for you or what you feel comfortable with and look at different, first of all, I want to say something. You have all different options. Students now, I mean, just it's much more than when I was growing up, and there's a lot more out there. When I ran the first 2 times, I ran outside the institution, and I was pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and I just kept going and going. And then I decided to try and change the institution from within, which is not for everybody, but I still don't, I'm my own person, I'm very independent. I want to say, you know what, I'm going to be 65 soon, and I'm a breast cancer survivor, and it's very important for me to be independent. But that said, I still am able to get into spaces where I have a big influence. And I want to point out that I volunteered on political campaigns. I did that when I was 16, I volunteered on a political campaign. And, I don't want to embarrass my staff member back there, but Javier was an intern in my campaign, and he was going to school at the time. and he was a student, and he's been amazing. He's now my director of communications. And, you know, it's also important for us as electeds to give a space for young people to grow and to thrive and to learn. So I think that's very important for us too, because that's the only way that we're able to get people to move up. So, thank you.
Thank you. And final question, another big one. Take out your crystal balls. What is the future of LGBTQ politics in New York City, and what should be the top issue of legislators as we move forward? And would you be as specific as possible?
Ask us on November 9th.
Sorry?
I said, ask us on November 9th, because, you know, we're in a period where it's, you know, and the reason I said that, I mean, it was as a little bit in jest, but our future is really up for grabs now. When the Supreme Court reversed Roe v. Wade, it put the LGBTQIA+ community in jeopardy. And, you know, now there's, I mean, somebody said that if Congress turns Republican, they're going to have a bill to do away with any kind of gay education, LGBTQIA education, and there's just all of these threats to have this done, and it's a real possibility. And so it's really important for people to go out and vote. And even in New York State, if you look at the polls, the Governor Hochul, who's the Democratic nominee, is, you know, the race is not as far apart as people think it is. And it's, you know, so it's very scary. It's very scary that we have people running who want to undo everything that we've fought for over the last, like, you know, decades, but it's a real possibility. So that's what I'm saying to you, that it's, you know, it's really terrifying.
I hope the future very soon includes the first trans elected official, right, in the city
Yes.
of New York.
Yes.
Each of us have broken through and eliminated a barrier, or you know, crashed through a ceiling, but there are still some ceilings that exist and have not been broken through. And I think there have been several folks who've run, but not yet won. But we will elect trans folks to office, and that is, I hope, going to come very soon. And I think you'll just, I hope, continue to see the movement embracing other movements, right, and moving to a place where we're working together on so many things. And I think one of the things that, you know, animates me, as we sort of are in this now emeritus role, you know, is economic injustice, right, and that all of us should be dedicated to eradicating poverty and not accepting the fact that there are winners and losers in this world, and some people get to be worth billions of dollars, but the vast majority of people struggle to make it through every single day. That is a queer issue, right? That is something all of us should be invested in changing the narrative, right? That there's this inevitability of poverty, right? There's this inevitability. We just have to accept it. That's the way it is. We don't have to accept it. That doesn't have to be the world that we live in. And I hope that our movement, the LGBTQ queer movement, dives into that space even more and sees economic injustice as very much our issue.
I mean, I want to be, like, try to be as specific as possible and talk about legislation and budget, like, line items. I think, you know, we have to be advocating to spending more of our dollars to supporting our community. I think curriculum in our schools is, like, critical. But then also looking at all of these different issues that we're facing as a city and viewing them through the lens of them being queer issues, right? And so we have to work on breaking the pipeline of criminalization and incarceration, because we know that disproportionately queer folks find themselves in our jails and prisons, right? And so doing things like passing the Fair Chance at Housing legislation that Councilmember Keith Powers holds, understanding that formerly justice-involved folks are, again, disproportionately experiencing homelessness because they're discriminated against in the housing market. And then you look at that and say, well, where do queer folks fit into that? It's actually quite a few people. That we are expanding right to counsel across the board in lots of different areas, especially areas that particularly affect the queer community. And then that goes everything. It's like everything is an unfunded mandate unless you see a budget, a line item in the budget, and then saying, but then we have to really respect and value our indigent service providers and give them the resources they need, because currently they don't have them. We have housing attorneys that literally cannot take on any more cases in the midst of a housing crisis that is disproportionately affecting queer communities because we're not giving them enough resources to do that. We can't, the attrition in public defenders' offices is really, really terrible. There's no pay parity, and they can't stay in the jobs because it's just not livable, the burdens of student loans and the increasing cost of living in the city. Things like that, making sure that we're pumping more money into things like the Pride at Work initiative, understanding that good union membership and wages are a way for folks to be able, especially in our community, to thrive, who have been locked out of these spaces. I am getting ready to introduce a universal just cause bill, which I'm really excited about. Builds on now Comptroller Brad Lander's legislation that applied to fast food workers, but making sure that folks can stay in their jobs. And when we think about the jobs that are most at risk, right, with high turnover rates and lower wages, like those are the areas where it's hardest to organize and unionize. And so making sure that we are making it possible for people to keep their jobs long enough to build relationships, to unionize, to build power, to protect each other, so that people aren't experiencing discrimination in the workplace, including queer communities, right? And so like looking at all of these different areas and understanding how they can and will directly affect our communities, and doing that early on enough so that when we are advocating and organizing around it, that we're explicitly naming that, so that we are bringing our communities into the fight.
I would agree with everything that's been said here. I think that one of the things that we have to remind ourselves of is what's going on in Florida with Don't Say Gay. I think what's going on in Texas with elimination of trans rights, and even here in Long Island. My friend David Kilnick, who runs the LGBT network, just had a tremendous battle with the Smithtown Public Library, who was removing pride flags and LGBT books from its shelves. So that battle continues even right here in our own region, in our own area. But the future does look bright. But I think it's very important to say that for people like myself, who have had some privilege, who have been able to move up, who have become elected officials, and now I'm retired, that we can't forget that the movement needs to continue, that immigration is a gay issue, that housing is a gay issue, that criminal justice reform is a gay issue, the transgender issues are gay issues. We got marriage equality, and then the Pride agenda folded, right? The Empire State Pride agenda folded. Our agenda is not over. It's only really begun, and we have to continually fight for that justice. And so someone who, like me, has that privilege needs to recommit themselves to that struggle so that others who never got to what I have are able to achieve to the level that I've been fortunate enough to be able to move into. So I think it looks bright, but we still have to fight every inch of the way.
Well, this was inspiring, better than any history and political science course I've ever been a part of, and I want to thank you all so much. Really wonderful. And I want to tell the audience, remind the audience that these 4 and other LGBTQ elected officials, past and present from City Council and the state legislature, participated in our exhibit, A Seat at the Table. They did these oral history interviews, which were much more personal, right, than we talked about policy tonight. But so to get insight into their personal journeys, I would really encourage you to check out our exhibit, A Seat at the Table, online in LaGuardia and Wagner archives. And let's give them a round of applause.